American soldiers are pinned in a narrow Afghan alley, pressed behind a collapsing wall while automatic fire pours from a shattered apartment above them. They call for air support, hoping the gunships can reach what they can't. An AC-130 slips into its orbit overhead. Its lighter weapons can't punch through the reinforced room, trapping the Americans, and the crew knows it. They turn to the gun they reserve for moments exactly like this, an 11-foot steel barrel bolted to the deck. Below, the soldiers take cover. The aircraft settles into its firing line. The cannon slams back, the entire airframe shuddering under nearly 20,000 pounds of recoil. This weapon was built for ground crews, not gunships, and if the shot is off by even a hair, it will erase the very soldiers who called it in. The year was 1918. Despite the United States' best efforts, there was no gun powerful enough to counter the German howitzer cannons firing from across the trenches. American troops had no choice but to rely on British and French artillery to break through the battlefield. Still, the war was won, and American forces were ready to collect their prize, seized enemy guns, ready to be packed and shipped back to America. Engineers were already preparing their workstations to dismantle them and uncover every last one of their secrets. After a series of tests and initial prototypes, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department finally put together the most advanced cannon America had ever built, the model that would eventually be known as the mighty 105mm howitzer M1. The cannon and its variants became the cornerstone of America's light artillery divisions. By the time troops were called to the front lines of Europe once again in World War II, this would be the chosen gun against Nazi formations. The 1940s version of the 105mm howitzer, later known as the M101, was an expensive piece of artillery. Each one had a price tag, circling the $25,000 mark, equivalent to about $500,000 when adjusted for inflation. And that amount didn't even account for the enormous investment the War Department had to make to produce the necessary ammunition for them. Still, once commanders heard the M101 roar for the first time, they knew it had been worth every penny. Its 7.7-foot barrel could send shells flying up to 7 miles ahead at over 1,000 miles per hour. Even with that strength, the M101 remained just mobile enough for Allied troops to carry across miles of contested territory. Divisional artillery now wielded a weapon that could close the gap between light mortars and larger guns, like the 155mm Long Tom, nearly 6 times heavier, and which needed considerably longer to deploy and far greater cover from enemy interception. With a weapon like this, Allies could creep just close enough to German strongpoints, machine gun nests, or troop concentration areas without risking their soldiers. They could get an assault rolling almost instantly, softening the defenses ahead with a storm of highly explosive charges. By the time the Germans regrouped, Allied infantry was already moving in to finish the job. However, if the situation ever turned sour for the Americans, and the Nazis surprised them before they could mount an all-out attack, the M101 could also be used to bail them out. They could switch the howitzer's explosive shells with smoke rounds and engulf the entire battlefield in a dark cloud. Nazis could try to fire their guns all they wanted, but with their spotters blinded, they'd be shooting in the dark. In campaigns across critical battlefields like Normandy and the Ardennes, this could be a game changer, giving the Americans just the edge they need to get into the right position to strike back before Hitler had a chance to reorganize his formations. By the time the Nazis fell, more than 8,500 M101s had been built, and there was no doubt that each one had helped pave the way for another Allied victory over the Germans. The success of the 105mm howitzer was so impressive that even after the guns fell silent in Europe, M101 production did not stop. By the early 1950s, America already had over 10,000 of them in its arsenal. The M101 returned to the battlefield just 5 years after its last shells flew against Nazi formations in Europe. North Korean troops had just stormed across the border, launching a full-scale invasion of the South, vowing to unite the peninsula into a single nation under communist rule. American President Harry S. Truman refused to let Soviet-backed armies overrun an ally. He got his troops in formation, and within days, thousands were already marching across contested terrain once again, with weapons at the ready. Luckily for the armies, the M101 howitzers had not lost their touch, and the moment they began to burst their thunder across the Korean hills, it was as if the cannons had never fallen silent. The communists had the numbers, with about 1 million men stronger, according to reports. However, the Americans and their allies had the power. A single shell of the M101 could wipe an entire enemy squad before its salvos ever reached U.S. lines. Word of its performance and accuracy spread through Allied ranks, and by the war's end, every army in the world wanted the howitzer to form part of their arsenal. After Korea, the M101 continued its service across the rugged mountains of Algeria, the punishing deserts of Chad, and the war-torn streets of Rwanda during the nation's civil war, where in the hands of U.S. allies, it continued to demonstrate why it had stolen the hearts of American gunners the moment its first shell was fired. By the 1960s, few weapons could rival its balance of accuracy and destructive power. Wherever it appeared, no matter the continent or cause, troops armed with the M101 felt certain no enemy could stand before them. And then Vietnam shattered that illusion. The jungles of Southeast Asia were a battlefield unlike anything the Americans had ever faced. Here, the enemy did not play by the rules of conventional warfare. Guerrilla fighters moved like ghosts, hiding in the shadows of the tree line. They prowled the canopy by day and by night, and slithered beneath the ground through vast networks of tunnels that spread like poisoned veins across the land. America needed its mightiest artillery to use against enemy strongholds hidden among lost villages, deserted mountaintops, and the murky riverbanks that cut through the jungle. However, getting those guns into position would prove almost as difficult as fighting the enemy itself. In Vietnam, the terrain devoured men and machines alike, leaving trucks stuck in the mud and full convoys cut short by ambush. If American howitzers were ever to bypass these obstacles and reach their intended positions, they couldn't afford to roll across the terrain. They would have to be flown there. Weighing over 2 tons, this was no easy task. Aware of this limitation, engineers at Rock Island Arsenal began developing a lighter successor to their legendary 105mm howitzer, one that could be airlifted by helicopter or even parachuted directly into combat zones if the situation called for it. Built from aluminum alloys and lightweight materials, the new design cut nearly 2,000 pounds from the M101's weight, while extending its range and improving mobility. By lengthening the barrel to 11 feet, the all-new M102 howitzer could launch 33-pound shells as far as 9.4 miles, a distance of nearly 160 football fields. Its rounds burst from the muzzle at over 1,100 miles per hour, covering nearly a third of a mile every second before striking their target. The M102 could sustain a rate of 3 rounds a minute. Skilled crews could push this number to 10 rounds if needed. Unlike the M101, which required a full crew to dig up and reposition its split-trail carriage for each new target, the M102 introduced a box trail mount that allowed the gun to rotate a full 360 degrees and elevate up to 75 degrees skyward. However, despite its revolutionary design, American artillerymen were hesitant. For decades, they had trusted the M101. Every dial, lever, and recoil felt like second nature. Now, in a war more chaotic and unforgiving than anything they'd imagined, learning a new system felt like an unnecessary gamble. Still, Vietnam left them no choice. The Americans would have to fight with the M102 or not fight at all. The first M102s arrived in Vietnam in 1966. Older cannons required heavy trucks to drag them across rough terrain, but the M102 could be towed by smaller vehicles, which dramatically facilitated transport. Once at their bases, there were no limits to how far these howitzers could go. Commanders kept calling in CH-47 Chinooks and UH-1 Iroquois helicopters to lift them into the sky and deliver them straight to where the fight was taking place. Though some soldiers initially complained that the new cannons sat lower to the ground and were harder to load, any doubt about them vanished the moment they opened fire on North Vietnamese positions. Streaks of fire tore through the air, faster than any defense could take. In seconds, entire fortifications vanished, under the roar of detonations. Bunkers collapsed, the earth erupted, and debris rained back down in chaos. The M102 carried a shell for every occasion. High-explosive plastic rounds were perfect to bring down Viet Cong fortifications, while rocket-assisted projectiles could soar miles ahead to strike distant supply lines and clear paths for advancing troops. However, its most feared munitions came into play when the enemy drew too close. When North Vietnamese infantry surged across the lines, M102 crews leveled their guns nearly flat. A blast would then split the air as shells screamed forward, leaving behind an eerie buzzing, as if a swarm of angry hornets were about to strike. The projectile would then burst open mid-air, scattering thousands of blazing flechettes that sliced through the advancing troops as if a giant shotgun had been fired at them. If another platoon tried to flank the Americans, the gunners could simply swing the M102 around and unleash the same storm again. This was the power of the M546 Beehive round, a swift, merciless weapon that made it clear to North Vietnamese forces the U.S. had come prepared. The M102's destructive power wasn't the only reason it excelled in Vietnam. As the war dragged on, the howitzer became a favorite among American artillery crews for its easy handling. Once in position, operators could have it ready to fire in just 3 minutes, mounting it on a lightweight platform that allowed the gun to swivel a full 360 degrees. Using a panoramic telescope, crews zeroed in on targets with remarkable accuracy before unleashing their next volley. When visibility was limited, whether by jungle canopy or distance, soldiers could pair the system with external aiming posts, ensuring their shells landed exactly where they were needed, even against enemies hidden deep in the trees. By the time the war ended, even America's adversaries couldn't deny the nation had created something special with the M102. When North Vietnamese forces finally took control of the country, they wasted no time seizing the 105mm howitzers the Americans had left behind during their withdrawal. Yet neither the North Vietnamese forces nor their Soviet allies ever managed to fully replicate a cannon of their own that could combine devastating firepower with a remarkably light frame as the M102 did. America kept production of the M102 rolling until the early 1970s, adding roughly 1,150 of these howitzers to its arsenal before the line finally shut down. But even after production ceased, the gun would become a star player in one of America's first major military operations after Vietnam. In 1983, across the Caribbean waters near the shores of Grenada, a formation of American helicopters descended on the island, carrying with them a fleet of M102s ready to unleash their fury on the communist-backed forces, threatening to drag yet another nation into enemy hands. By now, American crews were masters of their craft. They could have an M102 locked and loaded in seconds, sliding high-explosive shells into the breach and firing before the enemy even knew what was coming. For the defending forces, armed with outdated weapons and little cover, there was never a real chance of outmatching the American cannons. By the time the smoke cleared, there was no question. The M102 was one of the most powerful guns the United States had ever wielded. For years afterward, from Panama to Iraq, the cannon would continue to prove its reputation. Yet even at the height of its glory, the seeds of the M102's replacement were already being sown far away from home. Aboard British Navy vessels sailing south across the Atlantic lay a battery of L-118s, a new breed of light guns bound for the contested Falkland Islands, where British forces would fight to reclaim the land from Argentine troops determined to drive them out. Like the M102, the British gun was a 105mm howitzer, light enough to be airlifted into battle by helicopters or dropped by parachute, capable of firing a wide array of munitions for every situation. Yet in nearly every respect, this new weapon could outmatch its American counterpart. Reports from the Falklands told of the L-118's devastating accuracy and its access to a broader selection of ammunition. Shells were up to a quarter more lethal than the standard high-explosive rounds used by the M102. And while the American howitzer already had impressive range, it still fell short of the British gun's reach of nearly 13 miles. The L-118's use of advanced materials gave it greater endurance, allowing it to fire hundreds of rounds in a single day without suffering significant strain or wear. Its design also made room for future innovation, including digital navigation and targeting systems that would continue to improve crew's ability to find and strike their targets. In the Falklands, the ferocity of the L-118 barrage was undeniable. Argentinian positions vanished beneath relentless shell fire, as British troops unleashed the full force of their charged superpropellant, hurling the most powerful munitions in their arsenal and obliterating entire enemy fortifications in a single blast. The Americans took notice and recognized that the M102, for all its strengths, could simply not compete with what the British had built. By the late 1980s, both nations reached an agreement, and the United States would be given the green light to produce its own version of the L-118. Designated the L-119, this new howitzer immediately became America's top gun. It was resilient against extreme climates, ensuring no battlefield, no matter how harsh, was beyond its reach. Faster, easier to fire, and later upgraded with digital fire control systems. The L-119 would eventually even be able to link with other guns to form a unified network of artillery, each weapon feeding data to the next for even more precise strikes. With such capabilities, the L-119 had no trouble serving America's artillery across modern battlefields from Afghanistan to Iraq. However, even as the L-119 took the place the M102 had once held, the legendary Vietnam veteran refused to fade away. If it could no longer fight on the ground, it would take its firepower to the skies on board a platform it was never intended for, the Lockheed AC-130. The AC-130 gunship was not necessarily as cutting-edge as frontline jets like the F-4 Phantom II or the F-111 Aardvark. Yet when it came to raw, persistent firepower over the battlefield, few platforms could match its punch. The standard version of the aircraft was formidable on its own, with 4 turboprop engines, the ability to operate at altitudes approaching 40,000 feet, and the capacity to deliver precise, sustained strikes from a wide array of weapons. Early versions even carried the devastating M61 Vulcan, a rotary cannon capable of firing on the order of 100 20mm rounds per second in short bursts, giving pilots a lethal edge when missiles weren't the right call to go against ground targets or low-flying enemy aircraft. But even with these impressive initial features, from the very beginning, Lockheed's engineers sought to expand the gunship's lethality. They reworked internal layouts, hacked at cavities, and rearranged gear to fit ever larger weapons. The first major evolution, the long-rumored surprise package variant, packed 2 40mm L-60 Bofors, among the largest automatic cannons attempted on a gunship at the time. Originally serving as a World War II anti-aircraft gun, the Bofors had already proved itself capable of hurling high-explosive shells across miles and helping bring down countless Nazi formations. However, mounted in the AC-130, the L-60 Bofors proved to be even more devastating by elevating the gunship's reach and destructive power, allowing crews to punish hardened positions the ground forces could not easily reach. This modification proved so effective that numerous successive AC-130 variants retained 40mm capability as part of their core armament. Still, the Air Force believed the gunship could go further. A 40mm cannon was powerful, but they wanted something greater, a weapon that combined extreme punch with an airframe-friendly footprint. And there seemed to be only one solution: adapt a field howitzer for air use. And the M102 was the perfect candidate. The first AC-130 to carry the 105mm howitzer was an experimental model, often referred to as Gunship 570. To install the M102, engineers removed a rear radome and a 40mm mounting from the rear doorway, creating room for the howitzer tube and its mounting hardware. Because of its size, only one 105mm howitzer could be fitted per aircraft, and it fired exclusively from the gunship's left side. That single cannon, however, was enough. The AC-130 instantly became one of the most powerful airborne heavy hitters in existence, and the attack platform fielded the largest caliber cannon regularly used by U.S. fixed-wing aircraft. When talking about the aerial use of the M102, Major Sean Silva of the U.S. Air Force has stated, quote, "We put these on vehicles, hardened targets, buildings, any kind of structure that we need penetrated." This proved invaluable during the War on Terror in Afghanistan. On the ground, when American troops found themselves pinned by enemy fire and armed with little more than their rifles to push forward, the M102 could come in to save the day. On board AC-130 gunships, the howitzer was able to clear out entrenched formations and free the American advance with ease. Still, the aerial cannon was so powerful that gunships could not simply unleash all their power at once. When engaging scattered fighters, the AC-130 would first employ its lighter armament, the General Dynamics 25mm and 40mm L60 Bofors cannons, which, while still packing a formidable punch, were precise enough to keep their fire contained within a small sector. But if enemy fire erupted from inside a fortified structure or entrenched position, the call would come to bring the M102 forward. When the order was given, the crew performed their final checks before unleashing the 105mm round. The shell tore from the aircraft faster than the eye could track, leaving behind a thin trail of black smoke as it plunged earthward. Barely a second later, the strike would find its mark, detonating with such force that the ground itself seemed to shudder. After a hit like that, the enemy would never fire again. The power of the airborne howitzer became legendary among air crews, and as new AC-130 variants entered service, the M102 was never replaced. Even the latest version of the gunship, the AC-130J Ghost Rider, which was originally designed to operate without it, in the end decided to keep the 105mm howitzer on board. Still, after more than 6 decades of service, some military analysts have voiced concerns that the M102's capabilities may be nearing their limits. In response, since 2022, teams of engineers have been working to modernize and extend the weapon's lifespan. While some details remain classified, reports point to a new and more advanced recoil system, as well as an updated flash hider designed to reduce visibility during firing. According to a statement from the Naval Sea Systems Command, quote, "The upgrades to the 105mm gun aircraft unit are sweeping. However, the engineers were careful to ensure that the functionality, accuracy, and usability of the weapon remain largely the same." Although experts remain doubtful about how many AC-130Js have received upgrades to the M102 howitzer, some reports suggest that at least 17 Ghost Riders have received the new system, but further installations remain on hold as the Air Force keeps redefining its combat strategy. Lieutenant General Michael E. Conley, commander of the Air Force Special Operations Command, or AFSOC, acknowledged this shift, explaining, quote, "As we look through our training portfolios and what we need to do for future flights, it probably involves less of the 105mm. We're looking at options for improved radars and other things that a traditional AC-130 would not have been asked to do." However, even if future technologies could eventually erase the need to include the M102 on military aircraft, officials have confirmed that at least for now, the M102 will remain serving on board the AC-130, ensuring that the legacy of America's largest gunship cannons continues to thunder across the skies for years to come.